The grand chandelier shimmered overhead, casting a golden glow on the glittering crystal, polished silver, and fine linen that adorned the dining table. Laughter spilled like champagne from every corner of the room, the kind of easy, elegant laughter that came from people who knew they were admired. At the center of it all sat Danielle Morgan, her posture impeccable, her smile effortless. At 38, she was the undisputed queen of Morgan looks, the cosmetic brand that had revolutionized beauty standards, sandbank accounts across the globe. Tonight was another lavish celebration, a fundraiser cloaked as a social gala, where celebrities, philanthropists, and power brokers mingled over truffle risotto and whispered promises. But Danielle's attention wasn't on the guests or the praise lavished upon her. It was on her husband. Julian, ever charming, ever golden, stood near the bar, laughing a little too loudly at something said by the young woman beside him, Danielle's new assistant. The girl leaned in, her hand brushing his arm, and Julian didn't pull away. Danielle's lips held their smile, but her eyes betrayed the flicker of something colder. She didn't make a scene. She never did. Her power was quiet, controlled, built on years of knowing when to speak and when silence could devastate more than words. She watched him the way one studies a painting you've admired for years only to realize the cracks had always been there. You'd just never looked closely enough. A toast was raised. Someone called out to Danielle and Julian, the ultimate power couple. Glasses clinked around her, but she barely heard them. Instead, her gaze dropped to her untouched wine, the red reflecting back a version of herself she wasn't sure she recognized anymore. She had fought, sacrificed, endured to build this life, and somewhere along the way, she had believed Julian was fighting beside her. Now she wasn't so sure. Excusing herself with perfect grace, Danielle slipped away from the table, her heels silent on the marble floor. The bedroom upstairs was dim, serene, a world apart from the dazzling noise below. She sat at her vanity, untouched makeup gleaming like trophies around her, and opened her journal. The pen in her hand felt heavier than usual. On the blank page, she wrote slowly, deliberately, Asterisk, would he still love me, if I lost everything? Asterisk, the words stared back at her, stark and raw. They had come before she could stop them, before logic or pride could get in the way. She looked at her reflection, still beautiful, still strong, but she felt a hollowness that beauty couldn't mask. What if he only loved the woman the world saw? The one with the empire, the influence, the perfect image. What if love, real love, couldn't survive the absence of power? A wild thought came to her, uninvited and sharp. What if she pretended to lose something that defined her? What if she feigned blindness, stripped away the image he clung to, and forced him to reveal who he really was? As the laughter echoed faintly from below, Danielle closed the journal. Her fingers lingered on the cover. A plan, reckless and raw, began to take root. She didn't know if it would destroy them more, finally show her the truth. Either way, she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Danielle Morgan was no stranger to struggle. Born in the sweltering heart of Ibadan, Nigeria, her earliest memories were stitched together with the smell of dust, the sting of hunger, and the dull ache of watching her mother work 2 jobs to keep them fed, while other children played with dolls or dreamed of vacations. Danielle studied by candlelight and sold sachets of water on street corners to help her family survive. Her life had been carved from resilience, and every inch of success she now wore like a tailored dress was one she had earned painfully, proudly. When she arrived in the United States for university, it was with a scholarship, a single suitcase. and an unshakable belief that she could build something better. And she did. Her cosmetics company, Morgan Looks, was born in a one-bedroom apartment with a handful of handmade products and a vision rooted in inclusivity. 10 years later, it stood as a global empire, a symbol of wealth, prestige, and the intoxicating power of reinvention. But even empires had blind spots. Danielle's was Bryce Morgan. They met at a networking event in Los Angeles. He was magnetic, broad-shouldered, quick-witted, the kind of man who drew attention without asking for it. Danielle, always calculating, felt something unfamiliar spark in her chest when he spoke to her. Bryce made her laugh in a way she hadn't since she left Nigeria. He listened, or seemed to, and when he told her he believed in her dream before anyone else did, she let herself fall. They married 2 years later. Danielle, already climbing, poured her savings into helping Bryce open a sleek downtown cocktail bar. The venture struggled at first, but she stood by him, unwavering. Through lean years and debt, she never once let him see her doubt. And eventually, her company took off, and with it, their lifestyle. Private chefs, a glass house in the hills, vacations in St. Bart's. From the outside, they looked like perfection, but inside the walls of their glass fortress, cracks had begun to form. Bryce had changed. Or maybe she had. He still had the charm. The smile that disarmed strangers and seduced investors. But behind closed doors, he was distant, cold. He rarely asked about her day. They no longer touched like lovers. And when she spoke of new ventures or global partnerships, he responded with tight nods or hollow congratulations. Danielle had built the kind of life she used to dream about in a garden. But the man beside her looked at her now like she was a mirror of his own inadequacy. Nina, her assistant, was a recent hire, 24, ambitious, always dressed to impress. At first, Danielle admired her energy, but soon she began to notice the lingering glances between Nina and Bryce, the flirtatious lilt in Nina's voice when she spoke to him, the way Bryce seemed suddenly lighter in her presence. Danielle said nothing. She was not the jealous type, but the silence between her and Bryce had begun to weigh heavier than any confrontation ever could. Only Ruth, the housekeeper who'd worked with Danielle for years, seemed to sense what was happening beneath the polished surface. Ruth moved quietly, but she noticed everything: the untouched meals, the rooms where laughter no longer lived, the way Danielle sat for hours alone in her sunroom, staring into nothing. Ruth never asked questions, but her eyes, kind and weathered, always held the kind of understanding words couldn't capture. Danielle's migraines began a month ago. At first, just a dull throb behind her eyes, then sharper, more frequent. The doctors blamed stress, ordered rest, gave her drops and painkillers. But the fear that accompanied the pain was something deeper. It wasn't just the physical symptoms. It was the sudden realization that, despite all she had built, she felt alone, vulnerable, and worst of a Lancia of the man who slept beside her every night. One evening, after a particularly brutal wave of pain and a sharp flash of light, across her vision, a thought came to her, not from fear, but from the gnawing curiosity that had always driven her. What if she lost the one thing Bryce most associated with her power? Her independence, her control, her sharp command of every room. What if she could no longer see? She didn't plan it at first, but after that night, she allowed herself to imagine it. A version of herself who was blind, dependent, vulnerable. And she watched Bryce closely to see how he'd react. She began to pretend, Small things at first. Missing a step. Asking Ruth for help with objects in plain sight. Then finally, declaring herself blind. The doctors had already noted unusual symptoms, and Danielle leaned into it. She told Bryce she had lost her vision completely. Only Ruth knew the truth. When Danielle told her, the older woman didn't gasp or scold. She simply asked, "Are you sure?" Danielle nodded, and Ruth's face softened into something like sadness. But she said nothing else, and from that moment on, she became Danielle's quiet accomplice. Now, as Bryce took her hand with practiced sympathy and Nina offered soft-spoken concern, Danielle listened more than she spoke. Every gesture, every word was a piece of the puzzle. She didn't want revenge. She wanted the truth. Would Bryce still love her if she were no longer the woman the world envied? Or would he simply find someone else to reflect the version of himself he missed? In the dark she pretended to live in, Danielle was finally beginning to see. Danielle sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression composed despite the chaos she had just declared. "I can't see," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Bryce stood across from her, frozen in place, a carefully curated mixture of shock and concern painting his face. "What do you mean you can't see?" he asked, as if the words themselves were unbelievable. The doctors, though perplexed by the lack of physiological explanation, had called it a stress-induced reaction, possibly traumatic. Danielle let their vagueness work in her favor. She didn't need them to confirm it. She only needed Bryce to believe it. At first, he did. Or seemed to. He brought her tea in the mornings and sat close to her on the sofa, guiding her hand toward her cup with tender, deliberate movements. To outsiders, he was the image of the devoted husband taking a break from his bar, giving interviews about their private family challenges, always referring to Danielle as his inspiration. At dinner parties, he spoke gently to her, his hand resting on hers like a badge of loyalty. But behind closed doors, the cracks returned, and this time Danielle was no longer ignoring them. He started small. Suggestions, really, you shouldn't be worrying about all those numbers right now, he'd say as he lightly skimmed the company's quarterly reports. Let Marcus handle the legal paperwork. And maybe I could help Ruth manage some of the accounts just while you rest. Danielle nodded each time, her face unreadable, her eyes though perfectly functional blank. She let him take the reins, watching how easily he stepped into the role of caretaker and opportunist all at once. He began moving money between accounts, authorizing changes in the company's structure, always with gentle words and a smile. Delegation, he called it. You've earned a break, Donnie. Nina became a more frequent presence around the house. She began stopping by in the late afternoons, bringing files Danielle didn't need and updates she hadn't asked for. Her perfume lingered long after she left, a sickly sweet reminder of the role she was starting to assume. Ruth noticed too, her lips tightening each time Nina floated through the hallway with too much ease and familiarity. Danielle said nothing. She needed to be certain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the house bathed in shadows, Danielle sat in her bedroom, door slightly ajar. She could hear them downstairs. Bryce's voice, low and relaxed. Nina's laughs, soft, girlish, intimate. The clink of glasses. The kind of laughter reserved for private moments, not business. Updates. Danielle stood slowly and made her way to the top of the staircase, moving carefully, her hand brushing the banister as if she truly couldn't see. At the landing, she crouched near the railing, listening. Nina said something Danielle couldn't make out, and Bryce responded with a chuckle, deep, unguarded. Then silence. Then another laugh, even closer this time, low and breathy. Danielle shifted slightly, reaching out to steady herself, and deliberately knocked over the glass she had carried upstairs earlier. It shattered against the hard wood with a crisp, final sound that cut through the air. Voices below paused. She heard footsteps. Bryce's. "Donnie, you okay?" he called up. Danielle stayed still, her expression blank, her eyes unfocused toward the noise. "I knocked something over," she said, her voice carefully dull. "Can you help me?" Bryce appeared seconds later, Nina just behind him. His shirt was Nina's lipstick looked freshly smudged. He helped Danielle to her feet with forced tenderness. "You really shouldn't move around alone," he said, not looking her in the eye. Nina stayed behind, hovering near the bottom of the stairs, adjusting her dress with poorly concealed awkwardness. Danielle let Bryce guide her back into the bedroom, saying nothing. When the door closed behind her, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the blank wall, the reality of her situation settling in with brutal clarity. He wasn't who he had pretended to be. The man who once held her hand in the dark, who claimed to believe in her dreams, was now carefully rewriting the story of their life without her in it, and she had handed him the pen. Not because she was weak, but because she had hoped foolishly that love meant something more than convenience. She was more alone than she had ever imagined. And for the first time since she'd begun the ruse, Danielle wasn't just testing Bryce's loyalty. She was mourning it. The days blurred into each other, heavy with silence and the steady, cruel rhythm of pretense. Danielle sat in her sunroom, each morning wrapped in a cashmere throw, listening as Bryce moved through the house like a man newly untethered. He no longer touched her in passing or asked if she needed anything. Instead, he offered hollow phrases in an overly loud voice, as though speaking to someone hard of hearing rather than blind. At first, she thought it was unintentional, a clumsy overcompensation, but it became clear he was no longer trying to reach her. He assumed she couldn't see and, perhaps worse, that she couldn't sense, that her intuition, her intelligence, her instincts had somehow vanished along with her sight. Late at night, Danielle would lie in bed, eyes wide open in the dark, and listen to the faint buzz of Bryce's phone vibrating across the room, the clicks of his fingers tapping out messages, the muffled laughs when he thought she was asleep. Once, she rose silently and stood behind the door, just close enough to hear him whisper, "We just need to be patient a little longer," his voice low and eager. "She's slipping." Danielle said nothing. She simply began to record, under the guise of voice memos, reminders for business, notes for her supposed new normal. She started capturing their conversations, innocent ones at first. Bryce gently suggesting she'll sell a few of her shares just for liquidity. Then more calculated moments, his tone turning transactional, his concern replaced with rehearsed kindness. He didn't know she had synced the audio to a hidden drive. He didn't realize she still checked emails through her voice-controlled assistant, reading out statements and alerts. The first real clue came from a quiet email flag. A fund transfer, then another. Money was moving in fragments small enough to avoid alarms, but too consistent to be accidental. When her chief financial officer called to confirm the new authorization protocols, Danielle politely asked for the details and responded with a feigned pause. "Let me get back to you," she said calmly. That evening, she called Marcus. Her brother had always been the one to raise doubts about Bryce, even at the wedding. when everyone else toasted. To the couple's future, Marcus had pulled her aside and asked, "Are you sure he's not just looking for a shortcut to the top?" Danielle had bristled at the time. Now, she clung to his caution like a lifeline. On the phone, she kept her voice measured. "Can we talk hypothetically?" she asked. Marcus listened as she laid out the edges of her scenario, vague enough to protect her secret, clear enough for him to grasp the danger. If someone were to shift company funds without full board approval, she posed, what would be the best way to document that? Marcus didn't press. He gave her the steps, quietly, precisely, like a soldier preparing someone for war. Meanwhile, Ruth's concern grew more urgent. The housekeeper had seen it all, how Bryce had stopped eating with Danielle, how Nina's car now stayed parked outside well into the night. "Ma," Ruth said one morning, her voice low but firm as she helped Danielle tie her robe, "he's changing. He thinks you're weak now, like you can't fight back." Danielle didn't respond immediately. She simply reached for Ruth's hand and held it tightly. It was the closest she'd come to breaking. But the breaking point came a few days later. Their anniversary for 7 years. Danielle had marked the day with something meaningful: letters, shared memories, even the necklace she'd commissioned for their 5th, carved with the coordinates of their first date. This year, there was nothing. No breakfast, no flowers, no note. Bryce didn't even speak to her that morning. By evening, he was downstairs with Nina. Danielle, perched quietly on the landing above, listened as they shared a bottle of wine. Nina giggled over something, and then Bryce's voice, warm and intimate, floated up the stairs. "Soon, this house will be ours, I promise." Danielle didn't move. The words hung in the air like a blade pressed to her throat. Not ours, not his and Danielle's. Ours, his and Nina's. He wasn't just unfaithful. He wasn't just lying. He was preparing to take everything. The man she had built her empire beside, whose dreams she had funded and whose failures she had forgiven, was dismantling their life brick by brick while she pretended to be blind. That night, as Bryce climbed into bed beside her and said nothing, Danielle turned slightly toward him and whispered, "Do you ever think about how we started?" He grunted, "Mm-mm." She smiled faintly, her eyes unfocused, toward the ceiling. "How we built all this together." Bryce didn't answer. Within minutes, his breathing slowed into sleep. Danielle lay awake, her chest tight with betrayal and fury. But beneath it all was something colder, a clarity she hadn't felt in months. He thought she was slipping, but she was watching, waiting. And soon she would make her move. The dining room shimmered in candlelight. The long mahogany table dressed in crystal, silver, and rare orchids flown in just that morning. Danielle wore a deep emerald silk gown, her makeup soft and deliberate, her hair pinned with the kind of effortless elegance that always made people stare. Across from her, Bryce played his role with polished charm. He poured her wine, pulled out her chair, even kissed the back of her hand like a man trying to memorize what he was about to lose. "Switzerland," he said, swirling his drink. "That's a big move." His voice trembled with carefully crafted emotion. "You really think this treatment could work?" Danielle smiled faintly, nodding. "There's a specialist there. Experimental therapy. It's risky, but I'm ready to try anything." Her tone was even, controlled, threaded with a believable trace of vulnerability. Bryce reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're the strongest woman I know," he said, his eyes a little too glossy. "I'll visit every month, I swear. Danielle tilted her head toward him. "You've always been so supportive," she whispered. "I wanted tonight to be special. One last night in this house. Just us." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping into that soft, affectionate register he once used when they were still in love or when he wanted something. "Whatever you need, Donnie, always." They ate in relative silence after that, the sound of silver against porcelain filling the space between them. The lies folded into each bite, each sip of wine, each smile. Danielle's chest ached not from heartbreak, but from the weight of what she was about to do. When dessert arrived, a creme brulee she had once taught their chef to perfect. Danielle set her spoon down carefully and rose from her chair. Bryce stood halfway, instinctively moving to guide her. But then he froze. Danielle turned and, without hesitation, walked elegantly precisely across the room. Her stride unbroken, her spine straight. She turned slowly to face him, her eyes steady and piercing. "I'm not blind, Bryce," she said, her voice calm but sharp as crystal. "I never was." The silence that followed was thunderous. Bryce stared at her, jaw slack, hand still hovering near his wineglass, as though the gravity of the moment hadn't quite hit him. Then it did. What do you mean?" he stammered. "Danielle, what are you talking about?" She stepped toward him, heels echoing off the polished floor. "I mean," she said, lifting a leather folder from the side table, "that I saw everything, heard everything, and I recorded all of it." Her voice didn't waver. The late-night phone calls, the financial transfers, the fake concern, the promises you made to Nina in the living room while I was upstairs. She opened the folder, laying out document after document, bank records, transcripts of voice recordings, screenshots of messages retrieved from their synced home devices. Bryce's face shifted, flickering between panic and disbelief. "Danielle, wait, I didn't. This isn't." She cut him off, her tone clipped and final. "You thought you could steal from me, from the company I built. You thought I was too fragile, too blind to notice. But the truth is, Bryce, I've never seen you more clearly than I do now." As he stepped back, grasping for some excuse, the door to the dining room opened quietly. Marcus entered, dressed in a tailored suit, expression cold and unreadable. He held a slim leather briefcase and nodded once at his sister before turning to Bryce. "I'm acting as Danielle's legal representative now," he said flatly. "Power of attorney was transferred last week. As of this moment, your access to all joint accounts and company funds is revoked." Bryce's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Behind them, Ruth stepped into view from the hallway, her face calm, her posture unshaken. She met Danielle's eyes and gave a small, knowing nod. She had seen it all coming. Danielle took a step closer to Bryce, her voice low but steady. "You underestimated me. You thought love had made me weak, that pretending to be blind meant I had surrendered. But what I was really doing was watching, documenting, preparing." She laid one final page in front of him, a copy of their prenuptial agreement. With the clause he had forgotten, any attempt at financial fraud nullified his rights to marital assets. Bryce sank into the chair behind him, eyes darting between the evidence and the people now surrounding him. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he whispered. Danielle smiled, not kindly. "You went exactly as far as you thought. You could without being caught. But the thing about pretending to be blind, Bryce, is that it gave me the chance to see who you really are." She turned to Marcus. "He can stay in the guest house tonight. I'll have security change the codes by morning." Then, with the grace of a queen who had never truly been dethroned, Danielle walked out of the room. Ruth followed quietly, her silence loud with vindication, and in the grand house Bryce once thought he would inherit. The lights dimmed on his performance. The curtain had fallen, and Danielle never, the victim, only the strategist, had taken back the stage. The morning after the confrontation, Danielle walked into her legal team's office with her head held high and her documents in order. She didn't hesitate. She filed for divorce that very day by noon. The papers were on Bryce's desk. By evening, the story had broken across every major media outlet. Headlines screamed the truth she had so carefully orchestrated. Asterisk billionaire CEO pretended to be blind husband exposed in brazen scheme. The public devoured every detail. News anchors dissected her brilliance, her strategy, her restraint. Social media turned her into a symbol, part icon, part cautionary tale. But Danielle didn't bask in the attention. She simply kept moving forward. Bryce tried to spin the story, of course, but the evidence was airtight. His bank accounts were frozen. The board members who had once humored his suggestions cut all ties. Nina disappeared almost overnight. Her resignation came via email, unsigned and emotionless. With nothing left to leech from, she vanished from the circles she once desperately tried to infiltrate. Danielle didn't bother to follow her trail. She wasn't a threat anymore. She never really was. Within weeks, Danielle had reclaimed every inch of her company. She restructured the board, removing anyone who had been too close to Bryce or too complacent in recent months. She promoted Ruth to head of Internal Affairs Trust, had become her most valued currency, and she invested in it wisely. She held press conferences with quiet dignity, never vilifying Bryce, only reaffirming her own strength, her clarity, her commitment to integrity. Behind closed doors, she met with auditors, financial advisors, legal teams, cleaning house, reinforcing every foundation she had once built alone. But the transformation went deeper than just boardrooms and press statements. Danielle also returned to the part of herself that had once fueled her rise, the girl from Ibadan, who knew how to stretch a dollar, who understood the ache of being unseen, unheard, underestimated. She began spending her weekends visiting women's shelters, not with camera crews or announcements, but in private, honest conversations. She shared her story, not the headlines, but the silences in between. The slow erosion of trust, the danger of mistaking charm for character. She mentored women on how to build businesses from scratch, how to spot manipulation, how to protect both their dreams and their hearts. And they listened, not because she was famous, but because she was real. She also gave herself time to breathe, time to laugh, time to learn what life felt like without performing. Slowly, cautiously, she began to date again, not men drawn to her title or her fortune, but men she met through friends, through art events, through spaces that had nothing to do with status. She led with her curiosity, not her credentials. And when she told someone she was building something new, she meant herself. Danielle no longer needed to prove anything, not to the world, not to Bryce, not even to herself. She had seen how far she could fall and how brilliantly she could rise. She had turned betrayal into strategy, silence into strength. And in doing so, she reclaimed her narrative, one hard-won boundary at a time. The afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of Danielle's home office, casting a warm glow over the space that had once felt like a battlefield. Now it was quiet, still, peaceful. The room, like her, had been transformed, no longer a place of silent observation and hidden recordings, but one of clarity and renewal. The walls, once lined with tension, now held framed photographs of family, of Ibadan, of milestones earned through grit rather than gloss. The air held no secrets, just the scent of fresh flowers and the soft hum of life returning to rhythm. Danielle sat at her desk, a simple, leather-bound journal open before her, the same one she had clutched the night everything began to crack. When she first scribbled the question that haunted her, asterisk, would he still love me if I lost everything? She ran her fingers over the worn edges, the spine softened by months of private confessions. Then, with a steady hand, she picked up her pen and wrote, asterisk, I thought pretending to be blind would show me who he was, but it showed me who I am. Asterisk, she paused for a moment, letting the words settle, anchoring herself in the truth they carried. She closed the book gently, a small smile curving at the edges of her mouth, not one of triumph, but of peace. It was the smile of a woman who had faced herself and won. A woman who had walked through deception, not only seeing the lies in others, but unearthing the strength buried deep within her own bones. She stood, her chair gliding back softly, and turned toward the light streaming in through the windows. No shadows followed her. No weight dragged behind her steps. Danielle walked forward, steady and unafraid, into the brilliance of a life she had reclaimed by choice, not by chance.